fancy as it looks right now, the first iteration of the game only had just the left hand side here, and enemies were spawned from the top and bottom, and the enemy waves would, well, enemy waves wasn't even introduced at that point. Enemies would just come in from the top and bottom. As time went on, and actually after the alpha testing, quite a few people said that the game seemed a bit too, as much as this is a slang word, they said it was too samey, which basically they meant that the level didn't seem like you were progressing, it was just in the same area. So obviously I had to focus on exactly how I'd give the player a sense of achievement, a sense of progression. So I introduced the second part of the map you see here, this middle part, and after that, I think it was like about 2 weeks after, I introduced the third part. Now, soon after that, I introduced the enemy waves. So you get the wave 1 come through on this half, wave 2 would be in the second part of the game, and wave 3 would be on this section of the game. And in that way, the player would have a sense of progression. Like you have to beat the enemies here to progress to second part of the map, and beat the enemies here to progress to the third part of the map. And people tended to like it. They said that they felt a sense of progression. They felt like they were advancing, and it felt like you were getting better at the game. You had something to work towards. But in that, I've realised that when I was watching people play the game, something which really sprung to mind and was quite annoying was I was watching people cheat the game. So when in section 2, when enemies would be coming from the top part of the screen and the bottom part of the screen, because obviously they were just moving vertically up the y-axis, they weren't able to follow the player. I hadn't added in that kind of functionality, and I didn't want it to be that kind of game. So when the enemies were coming from the top and the bottom of the screen, the player was camping in the first part, knowing that the enemies wouldn't be coming from this side anymore, and they would just be shooting into this middle section, or wherever they were. To be shooting into the third section, or from the first into the second, or from the second into the third, and the enemies wouldn't be able to get to them, obviously, because there's no AI that causes them to drive towards the player. So what I did was originally I blocked off the parts of the different sections via these red blocks, which you only open when you complete the section you're in. And as well as that, I added in something to the points mechanic. So in order for the player to progress to the next stage, or to progress to the second part, they had to kill a certain amount of enemies, or they had to kill the enemies to accumulate the points. So for example, you couldn't move onto stage or to the second part of the map without having 100 points. And let's say you had about, let's say the maximum amount of points you could get was 200 points in section 1. I set it to a fair level, so they had to accumulate at least half of that. So in doing that, I managed to balance the game in terms of difficulty, in terms of progression, in terms of flow, and the player had something to work towards in each section. So they had to enter the battle in order to fight the enemies, to accumulate the points, to progress to the next level. And the last thing I did was introduce the bosses. And if you watch the gameplay videos, they are terribly difficult to beat if you don't know what you're doing. So it gives a sense of purpose to the rest of the game. So going from section 1 to section 2 to section 3, you're supposed to have got better, or you're supposed to have at least grasped the best way to go about achieving certain things. So by the time the bosses come along, you should be near enough well equipped to be able to defeat them. Where the enemy waves were concerned, or just the enemies in general, I wanted to make sure, just like a lot of good games, or just like a typical game, you always have different bands of enemies. You have the really weak enemy, you have the relatively strong enemy, you have the really strong enemy, and obviously you have the boss. And you always have in-betweens, as I call them. So in between the weak enemy and the fairly strong enemy, you'll probably have an enemy that has a really weak exterior, so you can kill it easily, but it's got a really strong attribute. So I wanted to have a nice variety of these, and like I keep saying, if you go into the design document, you'll see that we've got the weak enemy, which is just a standard tank. We've got something called the Enforcer, which is the bigger black tank that causes more damage, and in between those you've got the Phantom Barrage, which is really quick, doesn't cause too much damage, easy to kill, but in a pack that can cause a lot of damage. So he's got the speed, but he doesn't really have the strength. As you see, you got the balance going on there, and obviously as you ramp up the scale, you've got the really big Enforcer, you've got Ghosts, and you've also got the bosses. So there is a nice variety of enemies. Just wanted to make sure that there was as well as them being well balanced, I wanted to make sure that when coupling enemies together, such as putting Phantom Barrages with normal tanks, or tanks with Ghosts and Enforcers with normal tanks, I wanted to make sure the enemy or the player always stood a chance, and that there was a good mixture. So if we let's say in wave 1 we've got like 5 standard tanks, obviously the difficulty needs to be ramped up correctly, also significantly, and allow the player to get into the game before being overwhelmed with wave amalgamations that were just really ridiculous, like 5 Phantom Barrages, and then there's a 5-second gap before 10 more Phantom Barrages. So I reckon in the end I got a nice balance of the difficulty scale incrementing correctly. And before I bring the video to a close, I just wanted to mention the power-ups. As I said before, something I really wanted to incorporate within the game was power-ups from all the research I'd done, and from what I'd accumulated from my research. That was a mechanic I really enjoyed. So as you can see, I've got different power-ups dotted around the screen. Obviously we're in the sprite placement screen at the moment, so we can't see all the different power-ups, but if you watch the gameplay video, you'll see there are different power-ups. There's homing rockets, there's bouncing bullets, there's a shield. So obviously this added more variety to the game, and also allowed the player to find their own way of playing the game, because not everybody's going to play it the same. Some people are going to like certain power-ups better, but my personal tip to all the players, being the designer of this game, the shield is a lifesaver in the game and will definitely make the experience a lot easier.